Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us again today. And welcome to another episode of the Social Exchange Project. As you know, I am your host, Xiong, and today we have a returning co-host who we love so much. We have the owner and founder of BB Beauty, as well as a master's in counseling, so a counselor here in the state of Wisconsin, Bao Li. So thank you so much for joining us again today, Bao.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. I love being on your show, Shane.
We love you. So, and today our guest of honor. So I am so excited today for our episode. She is a licensed psychologist, Dr. Xiong, a member of Project Chengdu, which in English means Project Sunshine. We will be learning a lot more today about this organization, as well as the general status of mental health in our community. So welcoming to the show, Dr. Xiong. Thank you so much for joining us today as well.
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So tell us a little bit about your background and kind of just your area of expertise.
Yeah, so my background is in counseling psychology, and I specialize in multicultural issues and trauma-informed care. And so I do a lot of trauma work, have worked a lot in the VA system, and then I've done a lot of research in specifically historical trauma experiences within the Hmong community.
Now, can you kind of, when we met a few days ago, you mentioned the historical trauma component, which was super interesting to myself because I actually didn't know that that existed. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what historical trauma is and why it's important for us to know?
Yeah, so historical trauma is a fairly new concept. And so, yeah, a lot of people haven't heard of it. And actually the idea of trauma within like the history of psychology is actually fairly new. We didn't really start looking into trauma until like the Vietnam War era, with the veterans coming home and experiencing these symptoms of nightmares and tremors and just difficulty sleeping and all of these symptoms that really kind of got the field to consider how do we address this and what is this, right? And so that's when the field really started looking into trauma. And that was only, in the 70s or so. And so the field of the trauma aspect of psychology is still fairly new. And then when we talk about historical trauma, that literature really came out from looking into communities that have experienced collective group trauma. And so traditionally in Western psychology, we looked at individuals who experienced trauma, so like a soldier who was experiencing trauma flashbacks and sexual abuse survivors, and then with historical trauma we're really looking at a whole community that went through some kind of collective trauma, and so it really kind of started off with the Jewish community and looking at the consequences of the Holocaust and how the entire community was experiencing in the aftermath, then problems with depression, anxiety, difficulty with sleep, and all of these trauma responses. And not only was the community and generation that directly experienced the trauma impacted in this way, but what the research was finding was that the subsequent generations were experiencing very similar symptoms. So the children of these Holocaust survivors, not having been through the Holocaust themselves, were experiencing very similar problems with depression, anxiety, nightmares, all of that stuff, PTSD, trauma responses. And so that's really where historical trauma came out of, is this understanding of like, this is happening in an entire community and it's in a collective experience, and that not only is one entire generation impacted, but the generations after that and the generations after that, and the generations after that.
Mm-hmm.
And so other communities really started connecting and identifying with that theory as well. So when we look into the Indian American and African American communities, really identifying with this like historical piece of an entire group going through this trauma, and then subsequent generations experiencing very similar symptoms without having that direct experience. So I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
It
So
does.
would that be the same thing
Yeah.
as intergenerational trauma then? Okay, it's the same thing, but there's just two different terms that they use?
Yeah, so historical trauma, this idea, there's a lot of different terminology that's used. So intergenerational trauma is talking about still the individual piece. So it's like one sold, let's say like histories of abuse in family. So one person's experience of abuse in childhood might be then passed down to, another person, their children's experience, and their children is passed down. So that's kind of what we talk about when we're talking about intergenerational trauma. Historical trauma is when we're talking about an entire group experience and specific events that we can point to say that completely shifted this community's experience. And there's also a piece of historical trauma, like taking away of culture, in that community is no longer able to heal in the ways that they used to be able to. And so that's kind of the difference. And so we can say that like historical trauma is passed down intergenerationally. But I can, we can get into detail with all the different terminology, but that's a really good point. But there's a little bit of a distinction there.
Okay.
So I, excuse me. So I do want to follow up on kind of what you were saying. So it sounds like a lot of this trauma, which the symptoms are kind of in alignment with PTSD symptoms, like not being able to sleep, having night terrors, flashbacks, and then how that can be passed down to the next generation of individuals who didn't directly have that experience, whether it was with the war, let's say, or with the trauma of violence and domestic abuse, let's say. Can you just break down a little bit of some of those concepts and how that really relates to Project Chengdu and or Project Sunshine, and kind of that organization of what and the missions of what you guys are working on right now through that organization?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, as far as like the passing down of those symptoms, it can be anything. And like when we talk about like PTSD in particular, that's also really looking at like the individual experience of like a set of symptoms that we can define as PTSD. And a lot of times, people within our community, when we're talking about the Hmong community in particular, having gone through a collective experience of massive group trauma, a lot of our folks do experience PTSD symptoms. And even beyond that, it can get complicated, because what we're seeing is even beyond just like PTSD symptoms, we're seeing complex trauma. So it can be like a messy set of symptoms that like we can't even define in like just PTSD. It's like PTSD and trauma, and or PTSD and anxiety and depression and identity issues, and we can kind of like, it gets a little bit messier. And so those are the things that we're seeing is can be passed down from generation to generation. And it makes sense, when you think about someone who in an entire community who went through something so traumatic, it impacts the way one connects with the rest of the world. So the world is no longer safe, right? Like you go through something like war and losing most of your family and having to relocate your home and your entire community. The world no longer feels safe, and you no longer feel like you can trust people the way that you normally were able to. And then your body actually goes into this state of just whatever it may be, the trauma response, it can be just like
Fascinating
completely
to
shut
hear.
down or just, like completely disconnected and emotionally unavailable. And in the midst of you trying to heal, maybe not being able to be as present with like your children because you're worried about putting food on the table, or you're having flashbacks and nightmares, and dealing with other stuff, or you're experiencing so much anxiety, that kind of you know experience, then your children can experience that. And not only is it the behaviors, but then it's also genetically, we're finding now that trauma lives within our DNA. And so your body goes into a stress response when you experience something so traumatic, and then when you go on to have children in the next generation, they have that
Kind of like a
DNA.
predisposition to
Right,
that. Okay.
right. That's kind of that can pass down those kinds of things to anxiety and depression and whatnot. And so how that relates to Project Chengdu and what we're doing now is that what we're seeing is, we've been, the Hmong community in general has been in the U.S. for like 40 years or so, and having moved past that survival stage of the secret war and relocation and just adjusting to life in the U.S. We've really kind of moved past that, and we're seeing our next generation being born in the U.S. and growing up in the U.S. And a lot of our young people may be experiencing similar symptoms of anxiety or depression, or like these complex trauma symptoms that might be related to this generational piece, right? Like this generational legacy of trauma being passed down. And so Project Chengdu, I'll just kind of jump into how we got started.
Yeah, I would love to learn a lot more about the organization's missions, vision, and values, essentially. So yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so we started as a call to action, in that there was a string of suicides completed within our Hmong youth that happened, and that continued to happen. But last summer of 2019, there was again a series of completed suicides within our young people, and one of the founding members of our group is a teacher who had one of her students complete suicide over the summer, and so she really had that heart to like say we have to do something. Within that week, she gathered a group of us. That's what kind of makes our group really unique, is like just a group of community members, artists, teachers, and mental health professionals to just start having that conversation of like, how do we start addressing this? How do we reach our young people and kind of help them through this, was one of our main goals. And then the second goal was really also, how do we support the families who are going through this with a loved one, having completed suicide. And so that's kind of how we got started, is just like, let's get together. This is something that's unfortunately, it wasn't just a one-time incident. And like, how do we start addressing it in a serious way, and like providing a space for our community to reach our young people, to offer some kind of hope and resources to know that there's help available.
Sure. So I do want to also kind of just go back a little bit, because I love what you guys are doing. I didn't know that you guys existed until the virtual concert that you guys launched a few weeks ago, which I think to date it's reached 42,000 or it has 42,000 views on Facebook. And
Oh,
so
wow.
that was actually where I learned about your organization. But I do want to go back a little bit and talking about just like a general history of mental health. So you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about historical trauma, but how have our community, particularly our community, how have we addressed mental health or even recognized its existence if we did? So I guess just give me a little bit of history about how mental health has been recognized or maybe treated in our community in the past.
Yeah, so this is a very complex, it's got so many layers, like type of question, but I love this question. We can spend a whole day or days like
How would I
dissecting it.
have days and days for
I can go on about it forever, but I'll try to kind of keep it short. First, I'll just kind of say that it's very complex because we're really talking about so many different factors and completely different cultures trying to blend in. So I will start by talking a little bit about what I know of Hmong culture and Hmong history is that we view and understand it, and you guys can kind of chime in too as far as like how you see this in our community. But from my perspective, we're a very holistic culture, and that we understand health and wellness more than just like beyond mental health, but like as connecting like the mind, body, and soul. And so our physical ailments have to do with spiritual ailments and, you know, vice versa. And so traditionally in Hmong culture, I feel like that's how we have addressed certain concerns within the community. So if someone was saying like, you know, I'm having all these nightmares and I'm seeing things and, you know, I'm having all these sets of symptoms, you might have like a shaman come in and kind of do explore then like what spiritually might be happening to understand your physical symptoms. And so the Hmong community never maybe traditionally hasn't looked at it in terms of like mental health, but our community, right, of like the mind, but that I think in our culture we've always kind of and continue to have an understanding of like trauma to one's soul and like what healing might look like. So there's that culture, and then we also then have the culture of Western psychology that really grew out of the medical model, and this idea that disease can be identified and we can diagnose and then treat a physical, you know, symptom. And that then psychology adopted that medical model to say we could see a set of symptoms, mental health symptoms, and diagnose and treat that. So when we're trying to combine the two cultures, what I'm trying to get to is the fact that it can make it very complicated then for someone within our culture then to say, I'm going to go seek out Western mental health services because maybe from that perspective it feels like I'm going in and being assessed and like being told that there's something wrong with me, right? Like there's
a
something
negative kind of like connotation with that is seen as like a stigma of mental health.
Right. That can come off very stigmatizing to say like you're in an isolated situation and I'm going to figure out what's wrong and we're going to treat that, versus maybe, you know, in our culture, a collective approach of like, okay, what's happening? What symptoms are you experiencing? And how do we understand what's going on so that we can help you? Can be a very different approach to understanding, you know, mental health. So it's almost like two completely different.
Like, how do you blend those two types of ways of thinking and ways of how you approach mental health where, you know, in kind of what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the westernized way of thinking, it's more acceptable in certain ways to say, hey, like if you have anxiety or depression, why don't we look at these types of medication? Whereas I've seen it in our community, we don't really heavily rely on medication per se. Like we look more at like holistic approaches, kind of what you were saying, to treat some of those mental health symptoms, and some of the physical symptoms that may come up. And so I can see why trying to see where you belong in these two spectrums of how to look at mental health can be really confusing for somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where we're headed, is figuring out how do we bridge the two, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And that, like, I think right now it might be, the culture might still feel, it still feels very stigmatizing to go seek mental health services, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to.
I think also kind of going back to the part of like seeking mental health, I think it's also hard to like being like an Asian, like Hmong American, and then wanting to seek like therapy from a therapist. And then when you go in, if they don't have multicultural like training or multicultural competency, then it's also hard for you to make that connection with them too, because they're trying to push on like the normal Western therapy upon you, but then it doesn't fit because we are holistic, like you said, you know.
Like how do we apply this to ourselves?
Yeah,
a Hmong American person.
Yeah, because I feel like when you're finding a therapist, it's like really, I mean, in general, like for, I think whether you're Hmong or not, like it's just, you have to find somebody that you vibe with or that they understand you. But I think it's particularly more difficult when you are a person of color trying to find somebody to try to understand you and your culture. Like when I went in to see a therapist and I talked to her about like my trauma as a child, you know, and feeling like that sense of abandonment and stuff. And she just told me, this is what she told me. Like I said, okay, so I said that I have a lot, I wanted to discuss like my mom's death because it's really traumatic of how it happened way back then. And she just said, well, because my mom died at 1. So then she said, well, since you don't know your mom, you can just maybe make up a story about who she is, like the more positive part of who she is. Then to me, I just felt like that was so, like it was not culturally competent, right? Like, because she wasn't putting into effect about like my culture or like just the fact that she's like, oh, you just make up the story, because she's so focused, you know. So she's like, we're just gonna do A, B, and C. You're gonna go home and you're gonna do this assignment and come back. And that just wasn't, I don't know.
Like it sounds like there was an area there that wasn't addressing, like the fact that losing a mom is obviously really traumatic, but like losing a mom in the Hmong community, like you don't have a mom, and you also, it's like a huge part of your identity is your mom and your dad and your relationship with them. And I'm not saying that's not applicable, of course, to any other, you know, cultures and races, but in our community, we do view it in a much more substantial way when it comes and relates to like how we feel about ourselves, our self-worth, our identity. So I can definitely see why there would be a disconnect there for sure.
Yeah, it was a total disconnect. And I think in general too, like just like with like our parents, like going back to what you were talking about, Dr. Ia, was like when our parents come to the US, right? And they have to like acclimate to like the American culture and the traditions and all that stuff. And then like there's like the whole role reversal too, where us children then become the adults who then takes care of our parents, like with translating and all that stuff. And just like how much pressure that puts on a young child. I remember being like, 6 or 7 and translating for my parents in the doctor's office or reading their mails and trying to understand what that is, and how much pressure that put up us and on our parents too, you know, and how much, like, how do you think that impacts our mental health as a community?
Like you almost feel like I can relate to that. Like you almost feel like you have a lot more responsibilities as a young child to care for your parents or grandparents as well, just even in the aspect of like I know the language, you know, and I can try and translate. So it's kind of like you are expected to grow up sooner than maybe you were cognitively ready to grow up. So I'm sorry, Dr. Ia, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's kind of one of the challenges of like maybe Western perspectives of mental health is it's a very individual healing approach, right? So it's like let's kind of just figure out you and like what you're going through and how, you know, like hear that story and find, figure out what your emotions are in that. And that's good and that's important. But what you're talking about is we're also then missing the entire cultural context to that and why it's significant, right? Like, and the fact that you're gonna go home and still feel this, how do we get like the entire community or family to get together to help support our young people who are struggling through this, because it's not enough to say I'm healing individually when I'm going back home and then an entire culture that where I don't feel a part of, or that I
don't feel that disconnect.
Where I feel disconnected from. And so there needs to be I think in order to truly be effective in the best practices within our culture in our community, because we are collective, the treatment and healing needs to be collective.
And so it's like this constant struggle between like individualistic values and then the collectivist value. Because when you're at school and away from your parents and your culture, you're molded to like, oh yeah, I'm going to think about me and whatever. But then when you go back home, like you said, then you're like, I feel it's like that constant tug between
like that dichotomy of both identities too, is like you feel like you relate to the westernized culture, but then also not enough, and then you go home and it's like you relate to it but also not enough. So how do we bridge those gaps? I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well, Dr. Ia, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit on some of the questions that I have, but I'm okay with it. How do you bridge that gap, and what are your theories, or what are the strategies that maybe you guys have thought about or trying to develop on how do we bridge that gap for our young people or youth, or just generally speaking, community members?
That's a great question. And I think we're still at the beginning process of trying to figure out how to bridge that gap. But I think that the first place to start is to kind of view things from a more collective approach. And so understanding that, if someone is coming in individually wanting to kind of heal certain parts, or like to talk through certain experiences, to understand what is the context of that, right? Like, how does that impact one's identity, to have lost a mom, at that age, what does that mean for you within, your context? And so I think the approach needs to kind of be collective. And what I mean by that is, that's why I think understanding historical trauma in the context of the Hmong community can be very helpful. It's this idea that our entire community was directly impacted by historical events, and that our entire community is traumatized. And so by just healing one person, that doesn't take away the fact that we're still going to an entire community that is traumatized. And so our approaches need to be community oriented. They have to be collective, and we have to figure out a way to a space to kind of really talk about it, and then to support one another. And so a very specific example of what that might look like is what we're doing with Project Chengdu. This idea that we are coming together, from all different approaches to have a conversation about, how do we reach and support folks in our community who might be struggling, that the conversation doesn't just happen one-on-one, but it's happening on a collective group level. And that we're starting off then by saying, like, how do we hold these events as a starting point to open up conversation, so that a person's not sitting in a room feeling like I'm the only one feeling this, but that we are opening it up to the entire community to say, like, wow, like, maybe these are all very shared experiences that a lot of us can relate to, and that it's okay for me then to open up about it.
And you're kind of normalizing, or I don't know if that's the right word, but you're kind of making it more acceptable to be open about some of the challenges that you are having as an individual with depression, anxiety, or any other kind of mental health, and having it be more acceptable to speak about it on a larger scale with the rest of the community that you are a part of, and saying like that you're not alone, and that tomorrow will come. And how do we, approach this in a way where it's individualized to you, who's very different,
Right.
but also apply it to the rest of the community in which you are a part of.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes a difference to like, you know, to go and talk to a stranger like individually, and for them to say like it's normal for you to be feeling this way, or it makes sense that you're feeling this way. When you're kind of going back home and feeling like, but this is something that I'm the only one who's feeling that, versus when we approach it from a collective standpoint and understanding like the context of it, that you can go back into your community and know that like I'm working on this maybe individually, but I also know I don't like it makes sense why I'm feeling this way, and that my community supports me in my healing journey.
So it sounds like you have to first come to terms with the fact that you may be feeling this, or that other people may be feeling this in your community. So it's addressing that awareness. And then the next step sounds like, you know, the education of what does that look like? What can that potentially mean for you? And then what resources are available so that you can be proactive and working through some of these challenges, as well as helping one another work through these challenges. Would you say that that is accurate?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one thing I do want to talk a little bit about is, you know, in terms of, and this might get really complicated, so just feel free to just touch briefly on it, and we can definitely do follow-up if needed, or if other people have questions about it. What do you think the current status or consensus is in the mental health community when it comes to the differences in gender, like, you know, a female versus a male in our community, and age, because I know your organization does focus a lot on connecting with the youth, but what about our you know, older generations or more traditional generations? And then also, how does that translate in terms of educational background and socioeconomic status? And I know that is so convoluted and so complex, but can you just kind of touch a little bit about what some of those areas of identities, like, I guess, what are the differences between all of those categories?
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to is the fact that we are all impacted differently, kind of depending on, you know, various factors. And so we don't have any like specific stats to speak specifically about within the Hmong community, to say this is like what the trends are. But
this is legitimate data that we have that exists now.
Right. But what we can say, kind of like speaking generally when we talk about gender, is that the literature shows that just in general, I don't know if this necessarily applies to the Hmong community, but in general, men and women might have like the same experiences of like suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, but that men tend to complete suicide at a higher rate than women. And what they're theorizing is that the reason for that is men might tend to use more lethal means. So maybe, you know, more likely to just use more lethal means, and that might be the reason. But so that,
and don't men are less likely to report also, like, or like to get help as compared to women?
Yeah, you know what, I don't know about the research in that, but I can just say that like in general, as far as like being open to talking about feelings and difficulties, that that in, you know, socially it just seems more acceptable for women to do that than men, and so that can be a huge challenge and barrier for men.
And I know it's like, so, you know, as among women, I'm always so focused on like the women's aspect, as like perspective of things. Like when there's like domestic violence, I'm always focused on like the women's, or just any issue is like about the women. But sometimes when I sit and I think about like just like the masculinity identity that like society in general puts upon men, and then also the extra pressure of being like a Hmong man, and what all of
Mhm.
like the pressures that comes with that, you know, where like they have to take care of the parents, they have to be like the name of the house, like, you know, the leader of their house or whatever. And just like how much, because I noticed that like with like there's not a lot of Hmong men that are like, as women, Hmong women are surpassing Hmong men in obtaining like higher degrees, right? Like higher, like more professional higher degrees. And I just feel like, why is that happening? Is it because of all like the social pressures that's put upon them? So they just kind of like, oh, whatever, I'm just gonna do whatever, you know, because it's kind of like that self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, of like, okay, if I'm gonna be a certain way, then I'm just gonna be that certain way. I'm just gonna fulfill it.
Yeah, it's so complex and so many layers.
Mhm.
It's dissecting all of that, but I think it comes back to this idea that we might all be struggling when we think about it in the context of historical trauma. It might be impacting us all, but that it might look very different depending on, you know, all those different factors of gender and
gender
age
and
and
identity.
yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Gotcha. So one of the other things also is, you know, obviously we are all experiencing a huge pandemic with COVID-19, and
Mhm.
in which I think many people can say that this in itself is really traumatic. And so
Yeah.
we
Mhm.
wonder a lot, or, you know, we can all kind of speculate, how does this, what are your thoughts on how this particular pandemic, how it is either exacerbating some of the mental health that currently exists out there with this current generation, and what are your thoughts about how that might affect generations to come? It's a huge
Yeah.
question, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so absolutely the pandemic right now is traumatic. And I say that because, you know, even though we can maybe in this country like sit in the comfort of our homes and ignore it
Mhm.
sometimes, I would go on to say that it is traumatic, and that there's always this kind of looming fear of real fear of
Mhm.
threat of death, that's kind of there. And so, and the world as we know it will never be the same. And so those two things, you know, really um, is kind of the definition of trauma. And so it would make sense that a lot of people are experiencing a lot of fear and depression and just, you know, worries
Mhm.
about how do we kind of make sense of all this and move forward with our life and our world. And that those things might be peaking right now, that it would be understandable if you're experiencing higher symptoms or feelings of, you know, sadness, depression, and anxiety. Um, and that we also know that when we're going through something like this, it can potentially be re-triggering past traumas. And so I would imagine that within our community, in particular, the generation who went through the trauma of the Secret War, that they might be experiencing a lot of triggers right now of that fear of when will I get to see my family again, you know,
Kind of
or
like you go back into survival mode, you know,
yeah,
like,
yeah, or
and
like,
I want to touch on this other side note too, is a lot of the hoarding that had happened, you know, and it wasn't just
mm-hmm,
in our community, but I
yeah,
know that it was frowned upon when everybody was collecting bags of rice, you know,
Right.
and it was
yes,
like
yeah,
people were like, oh my gosh, you guys are hoarders, you guys are terrible, like, but
Yeah.
really
yeah,
I think what it was I think people don't realize that it was re-triggering of that trauma
Yeah.
of like, we need to get into survival mode, so let's stock up on what we can,
yeah,
which is rice, which are supplies, which are all these other things, because
yeah,
that was what the generation before us knew, like
Mhm.
my
yeah,
parents, my grandparents, because it was like, we may not be able to have opportunities for getting these supplies later, so
Yeah.
let's
yeah,
get it now, you know. And so I
yeah,
think that's one of the points too that was brought up, that I was like, I didn't think about it like that,
Mhm.
you know. And so
yeah,
yeah, so that was very applicable what you just said there with currently what's happening right now.
Yeah, and
yeah,
like that
totally.
did bring back a lot of memories too, because I grew up in like a refugee camp too, and I will remember they
Mm-hmm.
would drop rice only certain times, you know. So I think that
Yes,
when you're talking about that Xiong, you're like, it really does re-trigger for our parents, because they did live in a time when they did have to wait to get food. You know,
Yeah.
so when the whole pandemic happened, they probably are worried that if we don't stock up, then we might not even be able to go to the store to get it, and therefore we will starve.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
It's that, like
Yeah,
you said, it's that fear of the unknown, like what
Yeah,
may happen,
totally.
what is it that I may not have access to, and so if I have access to it right now, let's pounce on it. So
yeah.
so
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's right. Like it's easier for maybe someone who didn't go through, you know, starvation to say like, oh, don't worry about it. There's plenty of food. Like, why are we stressing about that? You know, it's easier to say that when you haven't gone through something like maybe my parents' generation, where like they really knew what starvation was like. They really knew, like they really experienced like not knowing when they would get to eat again. And so that fear is real, you know, and for someone who hasn't gone through that, who's never known hunger like that or to experience that, it's easy to say like that's unreasonable, but again, it really is re-triggering past traumas, and that's one example for sure.
Yeah. And like I think on top of that too, like with all of the violence that's like happening against like Asians too within this whole pandemic, adds like this whole another level of like anxiety and fear for me too, especially for my parents. I don't know how you guys feel, but I get so scared when my parents go out without us because they don't know English, and two, if somebody were to attack them, they're older and they might not even understand what's happening, you know. So like this whole pandemic has added like a whole nother layer of like fear and anxiety.
Yeah. Again, that's like another re-triggering of like in our community when we think about our history, that there was genocide against our people, you know, for being Hmong. And so we're living in days right now where just for what we look like and our identity, that we're being targeted in that way. So definitely another example of how that can be re-triggering.
Sure.
Oh yeah.
So I think one of the other things too, and I know this is also very new, what are some strategies, I mean, in relation to COVID-19, what are some strategies that you could maybe bring up or have us consider in terms of staying resilient and making sure that we are doing our very best to address some of these mental health challenges that we could all be going through with higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of depression, higher levels of fear and the unknown? What are some of those strategies, and what are some things that we can tangibly say, yep, we can actively do this today? And I guess I'll give you an example. I was watching one of the different podcasts about what one of those strategies could be, and it was like, you know what, just wake up every day and get ready as if you are going to work. If you're working from home, making sure you have some sort of structure in your day and some sort of goal in your day, so that you can try to your best to, not that you're not addressing it, but you're doing your best to have everything stay normal, so you're not in like that panic mode, you know. What are some strategies that you think we could all kind of consider in terms of how we address some of these challenges right now?
Yeah, so just a couple of things, or like one thing that comes to mind for me is really considering that like even when we think about our history and the traumatic things that we have had to go through as, you know, members of the Hmong community, we can also really highlight the fact that we do have a lot of resiliency factors that, you know,
we do.
That it's amazing to really consider what we went through, and then to, you know, have to completely relocate to a completely different country where, you know, where our community had never known, right, or didn't even know that America existed in some cases, you know, and like to be plopped onto this alien country, and then to be able to rebuild community and identity, and the fact that we still have such a strong sense of unity and identity across the world,
and still assimilating to this culture.
Right, that like
I'm like getting goosebumps.
Yeah, no, that's for real. Like, look at all the crap we've been through, and look at just how resilient we are, that we're still standing today and like thriving and so strong. That it's important for us to acknowledge that there even when there are times we are struggling, that we have been able to continue to move forward as a community, and that in these times we can think back to how we did it, and ask for lessons, ask I like to ask my parents like how they did it or for advice, because at the end of the day they were able to survive and make it here, and they're they have that kind of wisdom, and so to tap into that and to identify like how did you get past it
like
before?
how did you develop that strength with even less resources than we our generation
exactly.
Yeah. So asking
and less money.
Right. And then also looking into your own life, that you also carry those resiliency factors, that in the past you've gone through some really difficult things, and what allowed you to get through it. And I think that's even the message that we're trying to share with Project Chengdu, and this idea of sunshine. What we're really talking about is that no matter how dark the world gets, no matter how challenging things are for you right now, stressful things may be for you right now, that the natural way of the world is that the sun will come up again, the sun will shine again. And how do we kind of sit through that darkness, trusting and knowing that, there is that hope that the light will shine again. And how do we just kind of hold on, hold on for that next day, to have that hope and to know that there's that. So there's nothing tangible about like that, but like I think that it can be helpful to remember that and to be reminded of that, that if we're, at home during COVID-19 right now, feeling scared or depressed or anxious, that like it makes sense why we're feeling that, and let's tap into our resources and factors that we have been able to do in the past, to look into what allowed us to get through it in the past, because
and apply
we
it
can
to
use
this
that.
situation right now.
Yeah, we can use that now.
Amazing. So before we let you go, one of my last questions was, we touched a little bit about bridging gaps and things like that, but what can we all do as a community to help you guys with your mission, or help all of us with this mission, essentially speaking? And I guess just how can we help? What can we do?
Yeah. So I think that it just comes down to continuing to bring awareness to the fact that there are certain mental health conditions, or like that it's okay for us to consider like our mental health, and that the more and more people become aware of it, the more we can then to loved ones create a space for it to be okay to talk about. And so that's what we're trying to do, is just create a space for people to know that like it's okay to be experiencing these things, and that individually we can create that space also, just by saying like, I can identify that maybe these are some depression symptoms that you're experiencing, and to be able to name it, and then to say like, I want to be an opening ear to support you through that. So number one, just like creating that space and having that knowledge, and then to be able to like offer specific resources, right? So maybe you aren't specifically trained in helping someone who's experiencing suicidal thoughts, but that you can then say like, I care about you, I want to support you, and I want to connect you with these resources. They are specifically trained to help you through this. And so that's another thing, is just like offering resources. There's a suicide prevention hotline that we can offer, or we can just say, let me figure out, like how to connect you with the resources that you need. So again, I don't know if I was like very tangible in that.
No, I mean, I think like what you're saying makes sense. So it's really about addressing that this does exist and that it makes sense, right? And that I, as a fellow community member, or as a friend, care about you and care about myself as well, that we should help each other. And I'm not trained, but look at all these resources that already exist in the community. So
Yeah.
you know, maybe remain open and addressing some of these things with people who are trained to address challenges with you.
Right. Because one of the risk factors of someone maybe completing suicide is feeling socially isolated, feeling completely alone. And so our goal to combat that is to just let folks know that they aren't alone, you know, and try to spread that as much as possible, as much as, you know, people in our community are being spaces that are saying, like, you know, you are not alone in this. The more we can combat that sense of isolation.
And I love that so much as well, because you guys did an amazing job with this virtual concert. Again, I'm referring back to that because that's how I discovered you guys. With this message of music and camaraderie and togetherness, and that like all those amazing artists that you guys were able to have on that virtual concert all addressed these concerns in their own way, bringing forth the love of music that connects all of us, and the, you know, how you guys have the really grassroots approach of things, and being consisting of mental health providers, but then also all of these artists that I think really connects with our younger population, or those who may be at risk of
and I think and I think it's also
Mm-hmm.
very powerful that these artists who have a lot of like younger fans, you know, that look up to them, and if they're on screen talking about mental health, like it's nothing, you know, like it's not this big stigma or this big negative thing, like we're just like, hey, let's talk about it. I think that's so powerful for them to see, oh, my idol is okay with mental health, so it must be okay for me to feel these things too, you know? That like whole universality, normalization.
Absolutely. Trauma is all about feeling isolated and alone. It's about being disconnected from yourself and your community. And so, something like the event that we threw is all about like, how do we really encourage people and like show people that you don't have to feel alone in it. And, you know, how do we help folks not feel so isolated?
And that to me is essentially bridging a gap. So you guys are doing an amazing job. And I'm so thankful that you were able to spend some of your time talking about all of these important things that matter to our community. And so thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, Bao, for always being an amazing friend to the show. And thank you so much, Dr. Zhang, for joining us today. I'm so excited to continue to help you guys with the mission that you guys have with your organization, and I will make sure to link everything in the description, as well as some of the resources for suicide prevention and kind of what exists.
Awesome.
So thank you guys so much for joining us today, and thank you guys all at home for tuning in today as well. So thank you guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, you guys.
Bye.